Yeah. Can everybody see the screen I'm sharing?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Cool. So welcome to this webinar on BowTieXP, the basics. And we're going to use an example of falling from height. So we're going to build a bow tie in the BowTieXP software, falling from height. My name is Jeroen van Dommelen. I'm a consultant working for Resilium. And Resilium is basically a bunch of consultants specialized in what we call barrier management or critical control management. We've got backgrounds in chemical, oil and gas, aviation, and we happen to love the bow tie concept. And for people who don't know the bow tie concept, I'm gonna show what a bow tie is later on in this presentation. Why the BowTieXP software? It's the software is built by a company called Wolters Kluwer. And we've got a partnership with Wolters Kluwer, so we're able to resell that piece of software. And basically we all come from Wolters Kluwer. So we used to work for Wolters Kluwer in the past, and we're now one of the bigger partners doing the actual consultancy on the software. So bow tie, a little bit of bow tie history. And we could trace the bow tie concept back to the University of Queensland, somewhere end 1970s. And a bow tie diagram is basically a concept built on existing models, but more easily explained. If you look at the chemical industry, yeah, you've got event trees, fault trees, and things like that, but they're not very visual appealing. So they came up with a concept of a bow tie, a bit more simplified, but you can go down the rabbit hole quite easily with bow ties as well. Now, what happened in the 80s? We had a big incident here in the North Sea, the Piper Alpha incident. And that's where sort of multiple big oil and gas companies and regulators decided that we need to do better in safety. And they start using barrier management. So what are the critical barriers that stop, in this case, a blowout from happening? And it got really embedded in oil and gas industry. Yeah, so all the oil and gas majors are using the bow tie concept for their major hazard risk assessments. BowTieXP, it started in 2005, a small company that started building a bow tie software package. And that grew to, yeah, I think they now have 4,000 or 5,000 clients worldwide. And the bow tie concept is adopted by not only the oil and gas industry, but you see it in a lot of other industries, from healthcare to aviation to defense, you name it, because it's a relatively simple concept, but it contains a lot of information. By the way, if you have questions, please interrupt me. Let's make it an interactive session. So what is a bow tie? A bow tie is basically a visualization of incident scenarios attached to a hazardous activity that you're doing as a company. When you start a bow tie, you start with what we call the hazard. or hazardous activity. It's something you do in your organization, but it has a potential to go wrong. The simplest example here is driving a car. Driving a car is something you do basically on a daily basis. But we all know that if we drink too much, we can end up in an accident. Or if we use our mobile phones, which is nowadays one of the major causes of incidents, you can end up crashing your car. Important about a hazard is that you give it context. So be very specific about your hazardous activity, because it's a major difference if you're driving a car here in Holland, in Amsterdam, or if you're driving a car in a desert in Saudi Arabia. There are different things that can go wrong. For example, if you look at driving a car in the heart of Amsterdam, not sure how many people have been there, but it's very hectic. A lot of bicycles, a lot of distraction, and one of the potential outcomes when things go wrong is that you can end up in one of the canals. Now, the nice to know fact is that there's an accident where a car ends up in a canal in Amsterdam once a week. So it's a very, very common thing that happens. And in Amsterdam, the local fire brigade has a 24 standby to get people out of cars. It's the only city in the world where they have a fire brigade ready for getting people out of the waters. Now, the good thing is, luckily, the canals are not very deep, so you will probably survive, but it's still a scary thing to be happening, I would say. So that's your hazard. The next thing you're going to describe is what we call a top event. And a top event is the first moment where you're losing control over your hazard. In the example of driving a car in Amsterdam, a top event could be a loss of control. It doesn't necessarily mean that you end up in an accident, but your car starts skidding. So you don't have full control over the motion of the car anymore. That's a typical top event. So it's not a catastrophe, and you can go back to a normal state. But it could be the starting point of something worse. Now, if we look at an example, for example, in the chemical industry, where you have a hazard, for example, a big tank with flammable liquids, and a top event could be a loss of containment, a small leakage somewhere in the pipe. No catastrophe yet, but you certainly want to detect that. If you don't detect it, you detect it too late, you can end up with a bigger leakage, and when you have a spark, you can end up with an explosion, fires, etc., etc. So top event is very important to define. It's the first moment where you lose control over your hazardous activity. We take a step further. Why does my clicker doesn't work? Oh yeah, here we go. And we can start defining what we call threats and consequences. And so here's where you start describing your incident scenarios. Can you see my mouse is here. So a threat or a cause is leads to a top event. And from the top event, we can end up with the consequences. So for example, my hazard is driving the car in Amsterdam. Top event is losing control over the car. And what can cause that top event to happen is I'm checking my email on my mobile phone, got distracted, and I'm losing control over the car. So on the threat side, you can do things like human factors, but also, for example, weather circumstances. If it's cold outside, the roads are slippery. That's also a reason why you can lose control over your car. Distraction, a lot of bikes, is a reason to lose control over your car. And so that's on the threat side. Consequence side, similar thing. You can have material damage, you can have injuries, you can have reputational damages, you name it. And obviously in Amsterdam, one of the consequences that I drive my car in the water and I end up drowning. Luckily, it doesn't happen a lot, but it is a potential outcome of this typical scenario. Now the fun part starts. So this is only describing the incident scenarios, but now we go into what we call barrier management. So on the left side of the bow tie, we've got what we call preventive barriers. And a preventive barrier basically stops a scenario from becoming a top event. So I've got slippery road conditions because it's icy. A preventative barrier, a technical barrier, in this case, can be I'm putting winter tires underneath my car, which prevent me from skidding. So that's a typical technical barrier. Another barrier you could implement is if I've got slippery road conditions, and that's a human factor barrier. A behavioral barrier is I reduce my speed. So I adjust my speed catering towards the weather conditions. So those are preventative barriers. They basically stop a top event from happening. But once you're in the top event, you want to mitigate your consequences. So we start implementing recovery barriers. Now, in the car, driving a car example, it's relatively easy. And one of the recovery barriers is a seatbelt, wearing your seatbelt. It doesn't prevent you from getting into an accident, but it limits the severity of the impact. Airbags, the same, limits the severity of the impact. Airbag is a typical technical barrier. It's built into the car itself, but actually wearing a seatbelt, and that's more like a behavioral barrier. And that's very dependent on risk perception as well. In most countries, people are used to wearing seatbelts. They feel safer wearing a seatbelt. But in some countries, I was in a taxi the other day in Turkey, and they didn't have seatbelts in the back, for example. They have a different risk perception there. So when you talk about bow ties for major risk in other industries, you have to deal with the fact that there's a different risk perception. So barriers or controls can be implemented in a different way because they deal differently with risks. So once we have the preventative barriers, we have the recovery barriers, we can go a step deeper, and we get thinking about what we call escalation factors. And an escalation factor is a factor that defeats the effectiveness of the barrier. So basically breaks down the barrier. Now, again, going back to wearing a seatbelt, or the airbag in this case, but let's take the wearing a seatbelt barrier. The fact that people refuse to wear the seatbelts is an escalation factor. So if we know that that factor exists in your organization, we have to deal with it. Now, in the case of the escalation factor about not wearing the seatbelt, we can introduce what we call an escalation factor barrier. And the escalation factor barrier is a technical barrier in this case. That's the annoying beep if you don't wear the seatbelt. So it basically forces people to wear the seatbelt. So in a nutshell, this is a bow tie. Want to pause for a minute. Is there anyone that has a question on the basic bow tie concept? Yes. No questions? Okay. Perfect.
Sorry. I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, I can't see the chat, but Isaac, can you read the question? I think you're on mute, Isaac. Where is the chat? Oh, here's the chat. I think we lost Isaac.
Do you want me to read it? It's
yeah, please. But yeah, for some reason I can't see the chats.
I think he's asking about we should consider for process flow that the recovery time in process normal conditions to each thread after consequence. What do you think? I don't know if it's available to explain more.
Even kijken, we should consider for, yeah, I see it now. Yeah. That recovery time process normal conditions to each thread after consequences. Mustafa, can you explain your question?
Okay, Jeroen, I want to ask this question. In terms of business continuity management system for the link, for each trade affect our management system. Maybe we should consider that especially after the consequence, maybe we should consider the recovery time, for example, or which process is most critical, maybe. I want to ask that question.
Yeah.
So I can explain clearly.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, Mustafa, and once you have an incident, for example, you need to recover back to your normal state of business. And one of the recovery barriers could be a business continuity plan. So you think of it ahead of the incident. Am I understanding you correctly, Mustafa?
Yes, right.
Yeah. I would definitely advise companies to do that. So you need to think about business continuity planning, but you also need to think about, for example, insurance. Am I properly insured to cover the damages in one of the consequences? Yeah,
thank you.
Good question. Good. Why would you need bow ties? We lost you, I think.
My laptop collapsed, sorry.
Oh.
Veronica has raised hand.
Yes, Veronica.
Yes.
Yeah, I have one question regarding this escalation factor. Is it some kind of related to human behavior only, or maybe double jeopardy of equipment failure can be considered?
No, it can be multiple things. So an escalation factor could be a human factor, but it also could be a technical factor. So if you don't maintain a technical barrier, for example, and you could have, again, influences from weather conditions, corrosion, wear and tear. So escalation factor can be multiple things.
Can it, I mean, like, is it common if we consider some kind like double jeopardy for the equipment? Is it part of this escalation factor as well?
You mean redundancy in equipment?
Yeah.
Yes.
Redundancy.
Yeah. So if you have a very critical barrier, you could say that. Now, for example, if you have a barrier that relies on an external power and you live in a country where power is not guaranteed full time, so the escalation factor would be we've got power outages in the region where a factory is. Then an escalation factor barrier is we can put a power supply, a generator, a backup generator as a redundancy. But if I'm talking about a hospital, I would like to have a double generator, a double backup.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once you have your BowTie, you know your incident scenarios, but you need to do a little bit more. Right? So you can start thinking about how critical is a barrier. What kind of activities do I need to do to maintain a barrier? Because a barrier slowly decays over time. That's a normal behavior of a barrier if we don't maintain it, if we don't look after it. And we need to make someone or a group responsible. And I see a lot of companies that don't take that extra step, so no one actually owns a barrier, which is obviously not a good thing. So we can put a lot of information onto the barrier. Now, what are the specific advantages of a BowTie? Sorry. First of all, the visual aspect. You've got a risk register, but if you can show a picture paints 1,000 words, we often say, very much attractive. Now, what you can also do, if you start mapping your risk register onto your BowTie, you can see other things. So, for example, in this case, I've mapped a risk register onto a BowTie, and I can actually see that one of the, sorry guys, een slokje water. One of the threats in this case doesn't have a barrier. So it's harder to spot when you're using a risk register. When I start mapping accountable people onto barriers, I can see another thing. So I've got an engineering manager. He is responsible for multiple barriers in this BowTie. What if the engineering manager has a problem at home or is addicted to drugs or whatever? So he's not functioning in your organization, but it has an impact on 4 barriers. And in this case, in this line, he's responsible for all the barriers in the consequence line. So by knowing this information, you can start improving your risk management. It's not part of this presentation, but that's the next presentation on the advanced features. What we can also do, we can link performances to barriers. We do that with an audit module, so we can actually ask questions in an organization whether we do the activities that maintain barriers. And if we don't do the activities, like for example, we need to train people, we need to do awareness training, but we also need to do maintenance on hardware barriers. And if we don't do the maintenance, your barrier slowly degrades. Now, by questioning the organization on your management system, you can actually see whether we do things or not. Now, obviously, the red things, something we don't do. So this could be the maintenance of cars, proper maintenance of cars. We don't do that. often enough, so it has a negative effect on the airbag in this case. So we can see the red and the green ones that we actually do things. What we can also do, we can use the BowTie, because we're talking about incident scenarios, right? So if you have a real incident and we actually had one of the consequences, you can go back in time to what actually happened. And by doing that over multiple incidents, mapping your incident data on your BowTie, you can also see which of the barriers have failed and are quite weak. And so just by counting the failed barriers in the different incident scenarios. So that's an added value you can do if you have your BowTies. Now, in the end, you want a picture like this. So we defined our barriers. The green barriers are functioning. We know who's responsible, and we know which activities are necessary to maintain barriers. Now, in this way, you can focus on the barriers that are red, that may be highly critical, to start an improvement plan. Cool. Going into the software right now, the BowTieXP software, show you how it all works. And I'm using an example inspired on one of the clients we have. And that's working at height in an offshore wind turbine. So it's a very practical case here on the North Sea. Yeah, Val, you've got a question.
Sorry, interrupting you. That's I've been studying the BowTie from different sources, and would like to find out from your point of view, from your experience. In some of the sources, they telling us that procedures, training, and competency should be removed from the preventative barriers. But I know it's different from one client to another. From your broad experience, what do you think are they can be considered as effective barriers against the top event? Like we have a procedure in place, we implement it, and we train the personnel. We did some like a measurement of the competence, something like this one.
Yeah. So I do recognize what you're saying. So the main consensus I think there is that a training is not a barrier in itself. So the training itself doesn't stop a threat to become a top event. But a training is part of a barrier. So the actual competence, if you look at, for example, the first aid, that's then not a preventative barrier, but it's a mitigating barrier. First aid, applying first. Applying first aid, that is the actual barrier. So you've got an injured person. What do? We apply first aid. In order to apply first aid in a proper way, we need to have first aid kits available. That's one activity. We need to check those first aid kits every year because materials get outdated, and we need to train people in applying first aid. So the training itself is never a barrier, main barrier on the BowTie, but it's an activity that is linked to a barrier to actually maintain, to keep a barrier well functioning. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, sure. Just yeah, it's more clear for me now. It's just like to take as a process and training and competence as a part of this process. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. So the question you need to ask yourself when building a BowTie is just follow the process. So follow the process of the actual incident and try to describe it in activities. So we've got an injured person. What are we going to do? We're going to apply first aid. We're going to call the fire brigade or emergency services. We're going to do an evacuation. And that should be on the barrier. That should be the text in barriers. And the supporting activities, we put them below the barrier. I'm going to show you that. So when you're looking at BowTieXP, and you start with an empty pane, this is where you start drawing your bow ties. So I've got an example here. I will show you later. I'll start with a fresh one. So here we start building the bow ties, and here on the left side we've got what we call the tree view. Now, and as you can see, there's a lot of information. I can actually link to barriers. I'm not gonna show you all of that now, and it's for later webinar, but I'm going to show you the basic elements we can put on a barrier, on a bow tie, sorry. So we start with defining the bow tie first. Now, what I can do with a right click on the mouse, I can define a new hazard in a tab called bow tie groups, new hazards, and the hazard name is working at height, and the top event here is falling from height. Now, you can argue that falling from height, is that recoverable? Can we go back to a normal state without any damage? In this case, I would say. So falling from height, that's our top event. And we start adding consequences. Injured person from hitting ground. Oh, sorry. Excuse me, my typing. And of course, you need to think about the context. Working at height, if I'm working on a scaffold that is 2 meters high, the likelihood of injuries is relatively high, but I'm not going to die from it. If I drop from a wind turbine, I will probably die from it. I will not survive that height. But I will show you how to do that in risk assessments, so we can risk assess each consequence. On the other side, I can define my causes. So I can have slippery conditions. Or I can have high winds that will cause me to lose my stability and I will fall from the height. What I can do now, so working at height on a scaffold of 2 meters. That's the context I'm doing my risk assessment in. When I now look at my consequence, you can see the gray boxes underneath the consequences. And here I can do a risk assessment. So it's a basic risk matrix. I can open up that box and I can do a risk assessment for people in this case. The severity, likelihood. Now, in this case, I'm working at 2 meters high. So I'm in the region of minor injury, major injury, and it is possible. Do it this way. So I've now risk assessed this consequence based on the fact that I'm on a scaffold 2 meters high. And of course, you can start adding consequences to your liking. Now I can imagine that falling from height, one potential consequence could be a dropped object. I'm working with hand tools. and if I fall, I drop my hand too. Going back to the left side of the bow tie, I can add controls. So every time you hover over one of the lines here, you can add elements. So in this case, I can add a control. And if I double click on the control, you can enter your barrier. In this case, wearing the right shoes. And a typical hardware barrier is I'm putting up a railing. So it prevents me from falling. Now, high winds, control is check weather conditions. So those are the preventative barriers. And on the mitigated barriers, you can have a harness. So we're falling, but we're preventing crashing to our deaths on the ground. And harness is actually, I would say, wearing the harness, using the harness. So this is how you build your basic bow tie. Now, when we want to add a layer, we can start adding the escalation factors or defeating factors in this case. People refuse to wear harnesses because it is time consuming. It is time consuming. So when you have an incident, you start questioning people. You often get arguments like this. Yeah, we're only working on 2 meter scaffolds, and it takes too much time to use the harness. So, and you put us under pressure, so we're not using it. Those arguments can be used. Now, and here we can enter escalation factor controls. So we start inspections. Now you get the point. So this is how you build the bow tie itself. The fun part starts when we are going to add data to it. Now I'm going to switch over to another bow tie, and this bow tie is not complete, to be honest. But it gives you an idea of a real bow tie, how it looks. So we're working at height, accessing offshore turbines, the top events falling from height, consequences, person impacts deck or hard surface, person falls into the water because we're offshore turbines. We've got a person stranded at height. So if you fall, your harness, you're hanging in your harness. It can cause suspension trauma. So that's a real consequence. Again, the dropped object, but also project delay. If you have an incident on an offshore platform, the project will be delayed, which is time, money, etc., etc. The causes of these falling from height are a presence of unprotected openings. Happens a lot. A hatch stays open and you misstep into the hatch and you lose your stability and you fall. Loss of structural integrity of the climbing ladder. Human factors, slippery conditions, high winds and sea sprays. Bird poop, slippery conditions. Bird poop is a very common thing on the offshore turbines. And so they need to remove the bird poop. Here on the top, I have what we call the expand levels, and I can start expanding the bow ties. Now I can zoom in and out, obviously. And here we have, again, the escalation factors. So when we look at the consequence, we've got the fall arrest system and harness and the use of it, wear PPE, apply first aid, and we've got an emergency response plan in place. With the escalation factor, incorrect wearing of the fall arrest harness. And they put in a body check of the fall arrest system. So basically stops, makes this barrier more effective. Now, what we can do is we can start adding responsible people to the barriers. Now, to add job titles, what we call in the software, we can go back to the left to the tree view again. I've got a little tab called job titles. If I want to add a job title, everything with the right mouse click, I can add stuff, new job title, engineer, or maintenance manager. So I've now added job titles into this file. And if I want to link job titles to barriers, I can just drag and drop and put it on the barrier itself. Click on yes. So the engineer is responsible for the use of the fall arrest harness and system. Now, do that. So this is the way we link job titles to barriers. Here you can see that we sort of color-coded the barriers as well. In this case, we're looking at a color coding of the effectiveness of barrier. So how well does a barrier function? The same information can be traced back here in the tree view, and here we've got a tab called effectiveness. And we've already defined a few effectivenesses, but if I want to add a new effectiveness, let's say very, very poor, I can easily do that. And I can also give it a color. Now let's make this deep red. Click on OK. And I've just created a new effectiveness. If I want to link this effectiveness to a barrier, I can simply drag and drop it onto the barrier, and it basically turns my barrier red. So for barrier, like this. Same color, chosen the wrong color. What I can also do, when we talk about your management system, we can define activities. So we've got a barrier, the apply first aid barrier, as I used an example previously. This barrier only works if people have the equipment and if people are trained to do so. In the software, we go back to the tree view and we go back to what we call management systems. And in management systems, we can define all activities that support our barriers. Now, again, with the software, right click, I can create a new barrier training 8. And as you can see, there's a lot of extra information we can put on the element of activities. So we can assign form, we can assign frequencies if we want, and we can also assign a responsible person to do that. Now, in this case, I would say a training manager is responsible for these types of activities. Now, just added a new activity, and I can link again this activity to the barrier. Yes. So here you can see that I've got multiple activities linked to a particular barrier. Now, what I can do now is I've got this little pen icon. So I can click on the pen icon and it opens up my information of the particular barrier itself. And as you can see, we've got effectiveness assigned. We can also assign a potential effectiveness in this case. So what's the improvement on the barrier we can achieve? We can assign a control type. This is what I talked about. Is it a behavioral barrier? Is it a hardware barrier? Is it an active hardware barrier? A firefighting system could be an active hardware in this case. So if the smoke detector detects smoke, it might cause an automatic sprinkler system to start spraying. That's what we call active hardware. If a human is involved, so the fire alarm goes off, there's a smoke detector detecting smoke, fire alarm goes off, and a person needs to call the fire brigade, which happens a lot. We talk about socio-technical barriers. So we can link that information as well. Socio-technical. And the reason why you want to do this, and especially major hazard scenarios, you want to have a healthy mix of barriers. So not only human-related barriers, because humans tend to be less reliable than hardware barriers. So you want a healthy mix of hardware barriers and human barriers. Now, by linking that information to your BowTie, you can easily assess how you are doing. Let me have a look. Yeah, so criticalities. We can link criticalities to barriers. Again, going back to the tree view, and we can assess whether it's a high critical or low critical barrier. Now, obviously, a fall arrest system and harness, when you're working at height, it's a very critical barrier. So you definitely want this in place. So you can link that to multiple barriers. So all the information that is stored underneath your elements in the BowTie, it can be made visible by using this eye icon or this icon. So if I click on this icon, I can turn on the displays. So if I want to show activities, I can click on long format, short format, or I can remove it from the BowTie itself. So you can easily play with what you want to show on a BowTie. So effective, I can switch on my color as well. Switch on the color of effectiveness or criticality, doesn't really matter. Or potential effectiveness, got no information in this case. The owner. So I can determine what is shown on the BowTie itself. Now you put a lot of information in your BowTie. You want some kind of reporting. There are multiple reports in the software. The easiest one I find is what I call the case overview. The case overview shows me the BowTie in different formats. So I have a classical format, which shows me the BowTies I'm working on, which shows me the causes, consequences, shows me the risk assessment. I've got a barrier register, which I like, control register. So these are all the controls I have in this BowTie file. So a nice thing to know is how many times a particular barrier occurs. So in this case, applying first aid occurs 3 times. Now, we already said it's a high critical barrier. So we want to assess the effectiveness of the barrier. If you've got a high critical barrier that is not performing, so it's got a low effectiveness, we want to improve that value, for example. Okay, there's one thing I would like to show you, and then we've got 5 more minutes for questions you might have. Is one of the things we can also link to barriers. I'm going back to my BowTie again. Is documents. So if you've got a procedure somewhere in a central storage, I've got a document link possibility. So I can add a document link. Now, in this case, I'm linking it to a Dutch website. I can put the location of that website in, click on OK, and I can link that to a barrier here. Oh, sorry. With icon, I can show all my documents, document links. Yes. Yeah, so I'm looking at the document links on the barrier itself. And I've got this icon here that basically takes me to the barrier, to the actual document itself. So this is in a nutshell BowTieXP. Any questions still so far?
In the beginning of presenting the the BowTie software, you also showed that under each barrier there is like a number of the failings during some over the period of the time.
Yeah.
Is it the different module, or it's in the generic software?
No, that's a different module. Yeah. Yeah, that is in IncidentXP. I can quickly show you that because this software I'm using contains everything. How that looks. So I've got a driving example of driving a car example here, and I can turn on my incident filter, and it looks like this. You get information like this, but it's a different module. Any other question? Then hopefully it was a clear story. Now, what we can offer you if you're interested, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions. I'm going to send a presentation with my email address as well. So reach out to me if you've got questions on the methodology or the software. That's no problem. Yeah, and if you want to brainstorm, if you're going to play with BowTieXP yourself, and if you want to brainstorm on one of the hazards that you faced in your organization, please give a shout. We're more than happy to spend some time on building a BowTie together to make it practicable for you and your organization. That really helps we love to help you over the first hurdle of using BowTies. So cool. We will announce a second session really soon, and we will plan an advanced BowTie session, so we dive in a little bit deeper into how to map incidents, how to do audits on your barriers, some more advanced filters, advanced reports and things like that. So keep an eye on our LinkedIn page, I would say. Now, thanks everybody, and reach out if you've got questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very informative. Thanks a lot.
Waiting for more information about the courses.
Yeah. Cool.
Definitely. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.